Coming up on today's Locked On Big Ten, we've got everything you need to know going into tonight's first college football playoff rankings reveal. Where will the Big Ten stack up? And also, as the conference starts to shake out and the standings start to get a little bit clearer, it's really all going to come down to the biggest games left in the season. It's that part of the year we've all been waiting for, finally here. And we'll take a little look at the roadmap to crowning a champion. Where are these biggest games as we go down the schedule? None this weekend, but there are a whole bunch coming. You're listening into Locked On Big Ten.
You are Locked On Big Ten, your daily podcast on the Big Ten Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Big Ten. Everything you need to know about the conference every single weekday. I'm Nate Dickinson, and thank you for making Locked On Big Ten your first listen every weekday. Our usual co-host on Tuesdays, Kevin McGuire, is out today. He's just a little busy this week. We'll be back next week, of course. Maybe just stuck in a big loss for Penn State last weekend. But again, we'll talk to him about everything going on with the Nittany Lions and the Big Ten, of course, next Tuesday when we get a chance to catch up. But that means you just got me today, but we've got plenty to talk about. Coming up on the show, the college football playoffs first official rankings come out tonight, and it may be the most questions we've had before a first set of rankings since this format got started up. Where will Ohio State land? What about Michigan State, Michigan, the rest of the teams in the Big Ten, and what will all of it mean for going forward? We'll talk about all of that. Also, Big Ten standings are starting to shape up. We're into the part of the schedule where teams are going to start playing each other for that ranking. We'll go over each big game left and when each one is down the schedule to get an idea of when we'll know when we'll have a Big Ten, not champion, but representative, of course, from each division, East and West. Right now, though, we'll get you into, of course, all the news from around the Big Ten today before we dive into our topic of the show. Rankings, of course, a big theme on our Tuesday programs during football season. We do have in the latest AP polls a new top team in the Big Ten. Michigan State, with the win over Michigan over the weekend, jumped Ohio State up to number 5 in the latest AP poll. Ohio State right behind them at 6. Michigan, with the loss to the Spartans, goes down to 9. Next Big Ten team in the top 25 all the way down at 19 is Iowa. Penn State clocks in at 22. And then Minnesota back receiving votes a whole lot more than last week when they had only one, up to 50 votes in the AP poll. That would put them at 8, 9, 31 if things ended up going down that far. So that's where we stand as far as Big Ten rankings in the AP poll. But as we know, that's not the one that matters. It's all about the college football playoff poll that we're talking about. We're going to get to that in just a moment right here on this show. Again, we're chatting about what will decide the Big Ten as far as the games on the field to end things. But of course, the college football playoff committee decides everything that really matters on the national stage. We'll get into what they may be thinking here on Locked On Big Ten. Today's episode of Locked On Big Ten is brought to you in part by Prize Picks. Now, Prize Picks, I know what you're thinking, just another fantasy sports site out there. And this is fantasy sports, but it is not just like anything else that you've seen before. I promise you that. Prize Picks works different. First off, if you're a college sports fan, they've got more opportunities to play fantasy with college athletes than anywhere out there. What you do is you go over to Prize Picks, you pick a group of players, or teams or anything that you like, and you end up putting them in a fantasy lineup with over and unders on props with their results. What you do is you end up getting that all together, and then once you're done, if everything that you say is going to happen happens, you cash out big. Multiply your money by 5, 10 times, even more. If you want to learn more about how it works, go to prizepicks.com. And I'm telling you guys, this is not just another fantasy sports option. This is something different. They're not doing it the same way everybody else is. So if you're itching for something new, I urge you, try out Prize Picks. Go over to prizepicks.com right now. Welcome back into Locked On Big Ten. Everything you need to know about the Big Ten Conference every day of the week, Monday through Friday. Not Saturday, Sunday. Weekends we take off. But we do have here for you on a Tuesday show. Kevin McGuire off today. He'll be back next week. As we thank you for making Locked On Big Ten your first listen of the day, the College Football Playoff Committee will release its first rankings tonight. It's at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. if you're in the western side of the Big Ten in Central Time. But it's a big, big chance for us to get that first look at where these people have these teams right now. And this is going to matter a lot, obviously, because these initial rankings are going to tell us just where obviously things stand with this committee in a way that we didn't know before, because the AP poll decides some things, but it doesn't decide everything. I mean, for example, Cincinnati's number 2 in that AP poll. They're not going to be number 2 in this college football playoff poll coming up tonight. At least I'd be really surprised. So where will everyone land in this poll? Let's start at the top, of course, because that's what matters. Top 4 teams get into the college football playoff. The 3 obvious ones who will be there: Georgia, Alabama, Michigan State. Georgia and Alabama don't need to explain. Michigan State, I guess I don't need to explain either. This is the Big Ten show. But those are the 3 teams right now that are still either just the one undefeated left Big Ten team in Michigan State, or Georgia or Alabama. After that, things get really, really complicated, because for that 4th spot, you've got Cincinnati, of course. You've got an undefeated Oklahoma still. Can't forget about them. You've got Ohio State. And when you look at the AP poll, of course, Cincinnati at number 2, so this doesn't really play out. But aside from that, it's Oklahoma 4, Michigan State 5, Ohio State 6, and then Oregon is number 7. But we're not really talking about the Ducks. That was just a misspeaking by me. As you look at it now, I don't imagine Cincinnati to be that high. I don't imagine Oklahoma ends up that high. I'd imagine we're looking at Georgia, Alabama, Michigan State, and then either Oklahoma, Cincy, Ohio State for that 4th spot. To be honest, I've been hearing mostly Cincinnati or Ohio State as to where teams are going to end up in 4. But obviously Cincinnati, I think, is the biggest piece here. Where the Bearcats end up, it's going to end up deciding a lot. Because Oklahoma, it's in the Big 12. If it goes undefeated, wins the Big 12 championship, it'll have that resume. It still has to do that. Obviously, if Cincinnati goes undefeated, it will have that resume as well. What we're finding out here is, where does the college football playoff rank that Cincinnati team with a weaker schedule against, say, an Ohio State, a Michigan, an even Notre Dame or Oregon? Because if Cincinnati's ahead of Ohio State right now, you have to imagine the Bearcats still have a chance. Still have a chance to make this college football playoff without anyone losing even still too. Obviously, if more teams lose and the Bearcats keep winning, they'll get their spot. I mean, people are going to try and keep Cincy out. After a while, they'll have to get in. But as things stand right now, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Cincy ends up left out here. And if that happens, if Cincy is below Ohio State or, say, Michigan State, obviously they'll be below them. Or not obviously, but anyway. If they're below an Ohio State, let's say, just for example, or any team like it, but let's say Ohio State for this case, what hope do you have if you're Cincy? I mean, you can hope other teams lose, but as far as controlling your own destiny, if you're not over Ohio State right now, you're not going to be over Ohio State when it wins the Big Ten. You're not going to be over any team that does win the Big Ten when it wins that Big Ten. If you're behind Ohio State right now, you're being told your undefeated season does not matter as much as at least you want it to. It's not enough to get into the college football playoff. You're being told that other teams are going to have to lose. I mean, that's always been the case for Cincy. But the idea that the other teams have all already lost and they're still looking at that situation is a little bit hard to swallow, I'm sure, over in Ohio. It's going to benefit the Big Ten. But if Cincy ends up getting left out undefeated in this first poll, I don't see how you can be a Bearcat fan and look at that and say, well, we've still got a shot the rest of the way. That would tell me that at the very least, the college football playoff doesn't want us. New Year's Six bowls all day long. They'll let us get into those all the time. But as far as what really matters, no, not for us. Looking down the rest of just the top 25 polls, obviously top 4 is what matters most, but I do want to say that obviously where the rest of the Big Ten teams land matters a lot too. I'm looking at like a Michigan, should be in the top 10, that'll obviously help, but more like an Iowa or a Penn State. Where are those two teams at in this initial top 25? Because obviously winning and losing is going to make them shift up and down, but where they stand here is like a big help or a big harm. to a resume potentially for a second Big Ten college football playoff team. And that's again, the big conversation we have when we talk about this. We know one Big Ten team's getting in. We'll talk about who it is throughout the year. But if there's going to be a second, then those rankings for all the other teams matter. So that's when everything else the rest of the conference is doing. That's when it becomes really a conference resume over a team's resume, right? Because the SEC's been doing it for a while. They've been able to say, hey, we're just the best conference. Put 2 of our teams in. Big Ten's trying to make that case this year. We'll see what happens. Only other thing I noted, as far as teams other than the Big Ten teams, like Oregon and Notre Dame, those are obviously squads that have ties to Big Ten wins. So better those teams do, better Big Ten teams do. And Wake Forest, going to crack the top 10, still undefeated. I mean, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion right now that no ACC team's going to make that college football playoff. But I don't know, it is a Power 5 team that hasn't lost yet. So it's just something to think about. We'll see how it all turns out tonight, though. Again, college football playoff rankings come out this evening. We'll, of course, have plenty to talk about with them tomorrow here on the show. Asher Lowe will be in, but we're not quite done yet. I'll be back in just a minute to break down a little bit more as far as the Big Ten's standings the rest of the season. You're listening into Locked On Big Ten. BetOnline.ag is the place to go for all of your sports betting needs online. They've got a brand new site up. It looks better than it did before, and it has better bets for you to place than it ever has before. A new look, a new way for you to bet out there. They're putting new props and lines up there all the time, and they've got special new ways for you to bet on the site for the football season. They really geared things up for the gridiron this fall. So take advantage. Head on over to BetOnline.ag. And be sure to, as always, use our promo code Locked On to get that bonus on your first deposit. Again, it's Locked On at betonline.ag, your online sportsbook experts. Hey, Dickinson back here on Locked On Big Ten. Last little bit of the show, I wanted to wrap things up just by, again, breaking down exactly what we're looking at the rest of the season in the Big Ten. Because it's become traditional that everyone just looks at the Big Ten standings. And that's obviously important. It decides who wins everything. But at this point in the season, in this particular season, it's really exciting because honestly, as long as there aren't any really surprising wins and losses, and I hesitate to say that because it is the Big Ten. Illinois beat Penn State a couple of weeks ago. But barring all of those other losses, again, they're going to happen. But it looks like, for the first time in a long time, it seems like at least, all these teams are going to decide the Big Ten against each other at the end of the season. I shouldn't say first time in a long time, but more so than it had been in a long time. It seems like all of the teams who are contending all pushed themselves to the very back of their schedules, and now everyone's going to play each other. I mean, Minnesota has to still play Wisconsin and Iowa. Michigan State still has to play Ohio State. Obviously, that will pretty much decide the Big Ten East unless Michigan ends up shaking things up by beating Ohio State at the end of the season. That's obviously another big game. But we've got Michigan State, Ohio State. We've got Ohio State, Michigan. We've got Minnesota, Wisconsin. We've got Minnesota, Iowa. These are the teams atop the Big Ten. I mean, if it ended right now, it would be Michigan State against Minnesota in the Big Ten championship game. Ohio State's still undefeated in the conference too, but as standing stand. Michigan State has to play both of the other teams, or has to play Ohio State, and Michigan has to play Ohio State too. Those are two games that are going to decide the East. Minnesota has to play both Iowa and Wisconsin still. Those are the games that are going to decide the West. So while it's nice that your team's on top of the conference right now, it quite honestly doesn't matter. For instance, Michigan State has a game over Michigan. If it loses to Ohio State, it's not going to make the Big Ten championship. If Michigan beats Ohio State and Michigan loses a game, it's not going to make the Big Ten champion. It's these games that are going to decide. Michigan State already won one of them by beating Michigan, so it has that edge. But I feel like I'm saying something everyone understands. The Big Ten standings matter. But like Minnesota has a game in hand over Wisconsin and Iowa in the Big Ten standings, that doesn't matter. They're going to play head-to-head. Whoever wins that game's going to the Big Ten title game. Again, somebody else could lose again and shake that up, but I really, really don't see those games just not mattering at the end of the year. So you can look at the standings as much as you want. This is what I'm saying, I guess, is that no matter what happens going up and down the standings the rest of the season, it's going to come down to those games at the end. That's it. I find it highly unlikely that we go into the last week of the season knowing which team on either side in this conference is representing the Big Ten in the Big Ten championship game. So given all that, you can kind of relax a little bit. I mean, obviously, if your team has one of those big games coming up, you don't. But for now at least, you take care of business, but otherwise, you've got your biggest games ahead of you. And you can really, really focus up on that over where you are in the Big Ten right now. Because again, it doesn't really matter. Nothing on the schedule with these big games this week. But next week, we've got Minnesota, Iowa. That's obviously a huge one. Michigan plays Penn State. Penn State not really in it for the national spotlight, but can obviously play spoiler. These teams, again, all playing each other. Week after that, Michigan State, Ohio State. Then the week after that, Minnesota, Wisconsin. It's going to be a game to decide the conference or help decide the conference every week after this one from now on out. And that is what you need to be prepared for. That is what we're going to do as we wind down the football season and, of course, get ready for basketball right here on Locked On Big Ten. It's every weekday. We'll be back tomorrow with Asher Lowe. He, of course, has everything we need to know about the playoff rankings that will happen tonight. We'll probably talk a little basketball with him, too. This has been Locked On Big Ten.